Hello, everyone. Welcome to yet another episode of your favorite podcast. I remain the one and only Toby, and with me, as usual, who does not have a choice on this podcast. Her name is Labake. Hi, Labake. How you doing?
Hi, Toby. Hi, everybody. I am great. I am. I'm good. I'm doing well. How are you?
Will you be happy to please tell our listeners where you are at the moment, if you don't mind sharing with us?
I am in London,
Yeah, enjoying the weather.
enjoying the weather, very much so, yes. Because as we're going to talk about in the news in a little bit, it's very hot in other places.
Yeah,
So I'm enjoying a break from the heat.
yeah.
Yes. How are you? Where are you, Toby? Someone had a nice little holiday.
Well, for my background, I'm in London. I'm back home.
Okay.
Even though I went away for a short holiday, just to regroup and refresh and rejuvenate and reinforce and recalibrate.
So how are you feeling
And
coming back now? Are
yeah,
you reinforced?
yeah, I'm back. I'm back to. I went on a spiritual exercise so that when I come back on
Okay.
the podcast, I can be giving you guys. I can remain your favorite with the way I give you guys the news, not the gossips, and always do everything to remain your favorite. But yeah, I went on holiday and I'm back. I'm ready to
So everybody
continue to
pay
do.
attention. Toby is supposed to be giving us his very best in this episode.
As I always do, as I always do.
Okay.
Awesome.
Awesome.
Yeah, so Nabaka, what do you have for us today on the news?
In the news. Okay. In the news, I think, and Toby and I were speaking about this not too long ago, but I think the news is inundated with a lot
Yeah.
of um stories about companies withdrawing, countries withdrawing, funds being pulled out. So we don't want to kind of repeat the same thing every week,
Yeah.
but just to kind of acknowledge that this is what's going on a lot in the climate and sustainability news space. One thing I did find interesting is a report that came out by BBC News that there's a road being built in the Amazon forest in Brazil to
Oh,
make space and make way for the COP30 conference that's happening later on in the year.
yeah.
So Brazil is hosting, and the tagline, or one of the taglines they're using, is talking about climate in or from the Amazon as opposed to about it, which I think is really interesting and a little bit contradictory to be felling trees and adding to deforestation of one of the world's, if not the largest global sink, carbon sink in the world, to build roads and make
Mm,
space for a conference to be held there. It seems a little bit counterintuitive to what the conference is supposed to be about. It's a climate
yeah.
summit. And so I'm just really intrigued by kind of the strategy and the thought process behind that. But, I found that really interesting this week and thought, let's share, let's talk about it. Would love to hear what everybody else thinks, what maybe
Yeah.
smarter people than myself kind of have thought about this. Maybe there's an angle to it that I'm not seeing, but yeah, would love to know.
And yes, if anyone from the COP30 planning team wants to come share more
Yes.
light on that, that would be great. Because we also want to know the idea behind such move, and so we don't want to judge. Like they say, we listen, we don't judge, right? And
Yep.
so we want to
Yep.
listen and hear your own side. And so if there's anyone from the team who want to share more light on that, that would be great. And to see that Labake ran away from Lagos, Nigeria because of the heat wave, I'm going to talk about that. So the Nigerian Meteorological Agency, which is the body in charge of making these predictions, have issued a heat stress watch, according to them, warning of a soaring temperature across the country, with some regions expected to reach a scorching 42 degrees. And so that is why, guys, Labake ran away
Can I
and
just point
to
out?
come on.
Can I just point out that in Europe, in the US, in different
Yeah,
parts of the world, we
yeah,
get heat warnings, like heat
yeah,
wave warnings, right? They'll let you know it's going to reach X degree, so put on your sunscreen, have
yeah.
water with. I have never, in my millennial 30 something years, ever seen a heat wave warning in Nigeria, unless I haven't been paying attention, but I've
Well,
never
now they've
seen one.
issued one,
Now they've
so
issued one, so it's
yeah, so there's
alarming, is my point.
yes, they've issued one, and they said the heat wave, like I said, 40 degrees in severe locations like Lagos, Jalingo, KB, and these are states in Nigeria. And the areas mostly affected is the Federal Capital Territory, which is the seat of power, the northern part, every region of the country has been affected. And so they're asking everyone to please drink plenty of water, avoid direct sun exposure, and wear light clothing. And also to mitigate the effect of this extreme heat, the agency called NIMET have advised Nigerians to please take precautionary measures. And I will do everything as best as possible to make sure that when Labake is going back, she goes back with cold in bottles so that when she gets to the airport, she can release it to the atmosphere and to help
Wouldn't that be
release and
nice?
reduce the temperature. But please, to our listeners in Nigeria, please stay safe, drink a lot of water, and wear light clothing. This is not a time to wear winter clothes when it's hot. So please take care of yourself and be safe.
So it's interesting that we're cracking jokes and bantering about the heat wave in Nigeria, but it's also interesting to think about it in the context of climate change
Yeah.
and the impacts and risks of climate change, right? So if it's getting warmer everywhere in the world, and the
Yeah.
countries that were already quite hot are getting even warmer, then we need to think about what risks do they pose to. And I think it'd be really interesting to think about what the food loss would be from this, what risks and impact it has on other industries like manufacturing and the food industry. Agriculture industry is a big one. Cold foods as well. It would be really, really interesting to see what the impact of this is in the space of whether it's a week or 2 weeks that we're experiencing this kind of heat wave, relative to kind of the other time. I think we definitely should have somebody that works in agriculture in Africa come on the podcast. It'd be really interesting to hear about what the climate change impacts are on their industry, their sector, their work. Maybe a particular focus for these heat wave times as well. Just thinking about it, I think it'll be a good conversation.
Awesome. All right then. So yes, if there's anyone in that sector, please reach out to us. Like we always do, we want to touch every aspect and to also get opinions and expert views. And so please reach out to us if you would want to come and share. And so without wasting time, we'll go straight into today's episode. We have a very special guest on the podcast, which I know you guys will learn from. And with all joy in my heart, I will hand over to the one and only, the incredible Labake. Just see, I don't praise you like this all the time. So this is what I've done, that just accept it and just move on and pretend you didn't hear me. So over to you, Labake.
So on the podcast today, we have an incredible guest who I think is a bit of a change from some of the guest speakers that we've had, at least in this season. But I think on the podcast entirely because he's in academia.
Yeah.
So he's a seasoned professor, Professor Wolfgang Lutz. He is an Austrian professor in population, demography, and education.
Yeah.
He is the 2024 Yidan Prize winner.
Yidan Prize Foundation winner.
There we go. He's the 2024 Yidan Prize Foundation winner, and he is one of the world's leading experts in the field of global population development and the interactions between demographic changes, society, the economy, and the environment. So he's got over 4 decades of experience and accomplishments in these fields. And it's an exciting episode. Stay tuned.
Stay tuned, guys.
Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Lutz. On this episode, we're going to be exploring your work in population, education, and the environment. So before we jump right into the first question, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your work and the work that you do in the space?
Okay, my name is Wolfgang Lutz. I am based in Austria, so I live in Vienna and work for the past 40 years for an international research institute called the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, based a little south of Vienna in an old imperial castle that the Habsburg family built. So it's a very nice work environment with a big garden. And in this institute, we do global level analysis of sustainable development in the broader sense. And my special field has always been population statistics, or demography, we call it. And I've been head of the World Population Program there at YASA for more than 25 years. And for the last few years, I was also Deputy Director General for Science for the whole institute. And I've been interested in Africa, well, from the very beginning, since starting my studies in the United States. I have a PhD in demography from the University of Pennsylvania, and I had many African colleagues in my class. And ever since then, I have a keen interest in the African continent and demographic trends, as well as broader sustainable development trends there.
Awesome. What an incredible profile you have, I must say. So, Professor Lutz, your research spans the interconnected realms of population dynamics, education, development, and environmental sustainability. Could you share how these elements interact on a global scale and shape our shared future?
Well, I think in demography, the main thing that distinguishes this approach from, let's say, economic approaches is that we focus explicitly on human beings. Okay. Demos, where demography derives from, is the population. It's the aggregate of human beings. Of course, there's also animal demography, where you look at sort of animal populations, but here we look at human populations. And our discipline is defined as also as the scientific study of changing population size and structures. Of course, the population size is quite evident. It's how many of us there are. And over the last half century, there has been tremendous population growth all over the world. But particularly on the African continent, we see by far the strongest population growth at the moment.
Yeah.
And then what is sort of the more interesting part of it really is the population structures, which some people see more narrowly as the changing age structure, like how many young people there are or how many elderly. But it's also the composition by gender or other what we call demographic dimensions, such as place of residence, whether you are urban or rural place of residence. And in particular, that has been the focus of much of my research, is differentiation by level of educational attainment. Like how many people by age and sex are illiterate, have attended at least some primary education, or have completed secondary or even tertiary education. And this changing composition of the population, both by age and by level of education, really matters greatly. It matters for economic development. It matters for the health of the population and public health systems. It matters for social security and retirement and challenges to education. So it's really all across the domains that the Sustainable Development Goals care about. Demography and changing population size and structures are really a key element.
Awesome. So you kind of touched on your work across, these areas, but I want to start with congratulations on winning the Yidan Prize. How do you think this recognition would reflect the impact of your work on global education? And what are some insights from your research that you think can guide policymakers in addressing the challenges of population growth and the environmental pressures that come with it?
Okay, well, most of education research really focuses on the process of education, of learning, what's happening in school. And that is very much concerned with individual cognitive development. Like how does a child from early years learn first how to speak and then how to read and write and get more information about the world. And so this is the individual learning. that has, of course, multiple consequences for the individual life cycle. It matters for how healthy the individual is, like what is the access to public health or how health-related behavior. It matters for how many children a woman or a couple chooses to have. And it matters greatly also for the economic standing, for income, for the kind of profession that a person will choose. But that's at the individual level. What I did from a demographic perspective is bring this to the population level. See, like, what difference does it make for our societies, whether a high proportion of the population or a low proportion has higher levels of education or is completely illiterate. I mean, throughout human history, 95 to 98% of the population were illiterate. And that only started to change in the late 19th century in Europe. So we should not forget that literacy, until rather recently in human history, was an elitist phenomenon. It was just 1, 2, 3% of the population. The elites could read and write, and the vast majority could not read and write. And this is one of my hypotheses, is really that the universal literacy, in particular also literacy of women and not just of men, has been really the key driver behind our modern rise, if you want, behind the Industrial Revolution, behind modern science, behind all the improvements that we've seen in life, including also our political systems. Democracy really only works with a literate population who can read and be informed. So that is sort of the general approach. And then there is a more specific demographic feature, is namely that we not only look at different age groups, but also what we say different cohorts. These are different generations. So we can model, just to give you an example, if we know, let's say, how many 20-year-old women today have high school graduation, so they've successfully passed through high school, we have a good handle to looking into the future. We know, like, how many 50-year-old women will have high school graduations 30 years down the road, because these women are already here and alive, and we know that their high school graduations in a way makes them different. It makes them act differently in society. They will be in better health. They will likely have higher income. So this is like how one cohort, how one generation replaces the earlier ones, the older ones, is a key feature of demographic analysis. You may be familiar with the population pyramid. That is sort of a plotting men and women, so typically women on the right-hand side and men on the left-hand side, and then you have them by age stacked one on the other. So typically in a young population, it looks like a pyramid. There are more young people. So what we've done is sort of add education, and we did this by adding color. So we colored in red those who've never been in school, and in yellow those who have some primary, or then green or light blue those who have secondary, and dark blue. So you can see how the composition changes. And many countries in Europe and then in East Asia have gone already through this fundamental transition to move from a largely uneducated population to a highly educated population through generational change. So you see that first it's the young people who get better educated, but then over time, these better educated people, or cohorts, as we say, move up the age pyramid. So year by year, they get 1 year older, and increasingly these better educated younger generations replace the less educated older one. And this is a fundamental process of population renewal that we don't only see with respect to education, we see it also with respect to attitudes or some sort of fundamental values that people share, and where the young generation may be different from the older. And slowly but surely, one generation replaces the other one. So that is, in a nutshell, the demographic approach, how we model, and it gives us a very strong analytical toolbox to both reconstruct the past trends, because if we know, let's say, how many 60-year-old people today have secondary education, we know like how many 20-year-old 40 years ago, even if we don't have a census. And so we can reconstruct that along the cohort lines, and we can do forecasting. We can do scenarios for the coming decades, even up to the end of this century, we have done population projections, not only by age and sex, but also by level of highest educational attainment. And this is where there's a direct link also to sustainable development, because so many of the goals under the Sustainable Development Agenda, the Agenda 2030, how we call it, are related to education. It's the individual empowerment, it's better health, and of course, education is also an important SDG in its own right. But it's also, and this has been part of my analysis over the last decades, how does the improvement in educational attainment strengthen the resilience of societies, enhances our adaptive capacity to already unavoidable climate change. And so that's where I had many publications, and I assume that has been the main reason for the Yidan Prize committee to choose me this time, because I could show what are the long-lasting beneficial consequences of education. Even though in the near term, it's a cost. We don't see much benefits. There are more children in school, but once these better educated children then grow up and help to change society, that's where the real impact happens.
Awesome. And I must also join Labake to congratulate you on winning the prize, the Yidan Prize, rather. Still on education, right? We say, or we know that education is a powerful driver for sustainable development. And in your view, how can transformative educational reforms empower societies to be able to adapt to these population changes while also preserving our natural resources?
Yeah, let me just talk a little about the definition of education, because people have different things in mind. And of course, when we start talking about population education, people quickly think of scholars sitting in school.
Yeah.
But essentially, we are talking about a much broader acquiring of skills. The most important are sort of basic literacy and basic numeracy skills. And in particular, the numeracy, I mean, if you cannot do some simple calculations, you will have difficulties throughout your life on the marketplace, if you go shopping or whatever. I mean,
Yeah.
Everybody to function in a modern society needs to have some numeracy skills. And equally, we also need to have some basic literacy skills. And here I should say that the PISA studies were conducted by the OECD, so show that even in rich industrialized countries, there are certain segments. In some countries, they are up to 25%, particularly about among young men, so young women that are doing better, are not able to read a couple of simple sentences with understanding. So there is, of course, it's the quality of literacy that matters greatly, that you really understand some text and can act accordingly and can sort of make a judgment what is meant by this text and how you react to it. This is new, as I said, in human society. Even in, let's say, 19th century Europe, most people were just only able to sign. They only could write their own name, and even not that. Like on some documents, if people couldn't sign the document, they made 3 X's saying that, yes, I did it with my own hand. And this was quite recently in some countries, even in Europe, this was just a century ago. Now in Africa, this process has started later, the universal literacy, which is now being pursued as a goal for many decades, but it really only started after the colonial period. And so it is in many of these developments, Africa, I think, is going through the same socioeconomic development processes as Europe did before, and then East Asia, who came after that. And but it's not so much different. It's just the timing that is different, and that has to do with the history, different histories on the different continents. So that is the skills. And then schooling, there are very different methods of conveying these skills. But of course, it has turned out that first of all, it is the human development, psychological development is such that at young age, really our brains are most open to learning. This starts really right after birth. I mean, I've been told that when a one-year-old child finally learns to walk, I mean, this requires so much synaptic reactions, and the synaptic density. Synapses are sort of the connections between the brain cells in our head that even a modern robot cannot yet simulate this. They cannot yet walk the same way that a one-year-old child can walk. And then has been shown that up to age 20, 25, we have an unusual ability to acquire new knowledge and store it and build new synapses. And then this speed of this slows down. And so it makes sense, of course, to concentrate learning in the early years of life. And that's why universally school systems are there focusing on early life, not forgetting, of course, lifelong learning as another thing to upgrade our skills. But the bulk of education really happens at younger age. And then there are quite different school forms, and that's where pedagogics and the more conventional education research comes in, sort of what are more effective learning methods or teaching methods and what are less effective ones.
Awesome. Your work also highlights innovative strategies to integrate population studies with education policy, right? Can you share some examples of initiatives that you found to be successful from different regions, and how can some of these strategies be adapted or scaled to work globally?
Yeah, I mean, what education has traditionally been a responsibility of the state in versus all societies, because it has such huge value for society, and this is sort of universally accepted in virtually every country. The main organizer of education is the state. Of course, over the last decades, in some countries, private education institutions have also taken on a role, but this is only possible in the context that the overall responsibility is with the state, and the state also addresses the education of the broad segments of the population that cannot afford possibly more expensive private education. So that is sort of the first premise, and because of this very important role of the state, it is, of course, the policy makers who are the key decision makers. And here, a key issue is to convince the policymakers of the overriding importance of education. This is not self-evident because it goes really very much down to sort of cultural beliefs. It turned out that in East Asian cultures, for instance, where the Confucian culture has always put a high emphasis on learning and schooling. This has been for centuries, actually 2 millennia. The Chinese and the Koreans or the Japanese cultures had this very high emphasis on learning. But interesting, this was only elite education. Again, in these societies, it was only 1 or 2% of the population who could meet these aspirations of higher education, of literacy. Now, what made the big difference for these societies, and I've studied this in quite some detail, how first Japan in the early 20th century decided to move from elitist education to universal education, and then South Korea followed in the 60s, and Singapore similar, China a couple of decades later. And so in China, you see a situation now where the young are really already very well educated, whereas the elderly, many of them did not have an opportunity to go to school, and some of them never went to school. So this was I sometimes call it, this was Confucius for all. It was really this transformation from an elitist to a universal education, universal literacy. And that has been a key prerequisite for the economic boom that we've seen in East Asia. And now coming back to Africa, some of these beliefs about the value of education are not as deeply rooted in some of the mindsets of policymakers. where, for instance, also in development, international development priorities, and this has also been reinforced by the World Bank or other institutions that rather gave money for infrastructure, building new roads, new dams, and new airports, which of course also matters. I mean, it's not wasted money, but I think there is now really enough evidence to see that the investment in the skills of the broad population, that is really the root cause of development. And for instance, the World Bank, they've now understood this. They have a major new focus now on African human capital, because educating the broad base population segment is so important. It's also important not only for economic development directly, but also for the quality of institutions, for democracy. You need to have an empowered demos, so to say, an empowered population, to exert the checks and balances on the people in power. So policymakers all around the world get quite easily corrupted by the opportunities they have and grabbing money, unless there is civil society, unless there is a well-empowered population that controls them, that puts the checks and balances. That's what the democracy is all about. And that's why I initially said democracy also requires an educated demos, an educated population.
So that's brilliantly said. So let's talk about these new models that you've developed, right? With your new models that links school enrollment levels to adult human capital, now incorporating education levels and the quality of skills. What have you discovered about the broader impact of education on health, on economic growth, and on gender equity?
Yeah, I mean, it matters for all these aspects that you mentioned. So first of all, when we started around 25 years ago to reconstruct time series for all countries in the world, not only by age and sex as they existed, but also age, sex, and highest level of educational attainment. So we knew at each point in time, let's say 1950s and the 1960s, how many women, how many men of different ages had what level of education. So this was the first truly consistent database of age-specific educational attainment. And that now was the basis of some econometric studies trying to estimate again how improvements in education mattered for economic growth. And that has been a topic that economists have been studying for many years. But what they took as an education variable typically is the mean years of schooling of the entire population, or the adult population, let's say above the age of 15. Well, this is not very sensitive to fast improvements in education. Like, let's say, as we've seen it in Singapore or South Korea, that there's in the 60s a major education expansion. So the young cohorts, the young age groups are much better educated than the older ones. So if you do it age group specific, you can see very clearly when these better educated age groups came into the main productive ages, like in their 30s, where they really became much more productive in the industry. They established their own companies, and there was really this higher human capital, as the economists call it, in these main young working ages. That what really gave a boost to economic growth. But the old measure of just looking at the mean years of schooling of the entire adult population is rather insensitive, because at the same time that the young ones are better educated, you still have the less educated or uneducated elderly one. So on average, the statistical signal, as we say, is much weaker. Improvement in the education of the young takes quite some years to translate into the overall average education. But if we do it age group wise, we can much better identify what's happening there in the young adult ages. And that's where we really very consistently could show the great impact of the universal basic education. We found out it's not just primary education, but also junior secondary at least, and best senior secondary education for the broad segments, essentially for everybody in the population. And this we published at a time when you may remember the Millennium Development Goals, that was in the year 2000, they had as an education goal only universal primary education for everybody, which was, of course, an important goal. But at the time, there was a belief that it was really primary education that is the key driver of development. Well, in our papers, where we had this more detailed analysis, also by level of education and age groups, we had this influential paper in Science that showed that it really requires broad-based education beyond primary education, at least junior secondary education for virtually everybody, to bring a poor country out of poverty and kickstart economic growth. And fortunately now, as you know, the Millennium Development Goals that were decided in 2015 with a horizon to 2030, they now speak of high quality, universal primary and secondary education. So this insight that secondary education really matters as well has now widely spread. Of course, in reality, many countries, and unfortunately many African countries, are still far behind these goals. So I've talked now about the studies that showed that the better education by age groups and cohorts as we model it matter greatly for economic growth. But we have other studies that show that health is really very, very much driven by improvements in education. We can talk more about this because this goes both through the individual health-related behavior. You know better what is good for your health and the health of your children if you have more education. But it's also, you know how to better access existing healthcare services, the healthcare system of a country. And again, the healthcare system of a country is a function of the average education in the country. Of course, it also costs money, so it is also a function of economic growth, but we could show what matters more than money is really what is in the heads of people. And we had a sort of a policy brief that summarized many of the studies that we did on education and health. And we summarized it under the headline, when it comes to survival, mind matters more than money. So what is in your head? What is the way you approach the world? How fast you can recognize things? That is more important than how much money is in your pocket. So that's health. And then another field of studies over the past decades has been on resilience to environmental change, to particularly the adaptive capacity to climate change. And we had many studies there. And if we have time, we can also talk a little more about this.
I mean, you definitely can introduce us to that as well. And then maybe link how some of these findings, or based on some of these findings, what policy recommendations would you kind of offer to improve the resilience of these systems, and then effectively manage kind of the intersection of population growth, education, and these areas that we spoke about, health, and environmental systems.
Okay, well, let's talk a little about climate change because this is really a hot and very important topic. The problem there is that the real massive climate change and the consequences there are still to come. I mean, we're already seeing some issues. We see an intensified frequency and strength of tropical storms and disasters of flooding. But for instance, sea level rise is just starting. So what we are trying to do is look at past natural disasters that are somehow reflect what we will be expecting in the future in a much more intensive and more frequent manner. So we looked at past hurricane impact or flooding impact or other events. And we also looked at the Asian tsunami that was killing tens of thousands of people in 2004. Of course, tsunami is different from the sea level rise as a consequence of climate change, but still we see some of the same vulnerabilities if there is a sort of a sudden rise in water levels. But let's go now. I mean, the hurricanes, they have been studied for many decades in many detail. There's a whole field of studies that is sort of disaster research. They look at like which households are more vulnerable to disasters. Of course, for disaster and flooding, it matters greatly that where your house is. If you are building your house in a safer location, as people have done over centuries because they had the experiences of flooding, but of course, partly due to population growth and also sort of a relaxed norms. People started, particularly poorer people, started to build their houses in the floodplains because that's where there was space and they could readily build it. And of course, not surprisingly, if you build your house in a floodplain or another location that is very vulnerable to flooding, then you are more likely to be negatively affected, to be hit by the disaster. So there have been many studies looking at the location and then also at the economic standing. Sort of if there was a richer household, they could often build more solid foundations. They could use concrete and stone rather than just a temporary wooden structure that was more vulnerable to wind and water. What had never been studied really, and that was to my surprise as somebody sort of entering this field with a view of education, most of the surveys actually never asked about what was the education of the people in the household. They only looked at the kind of type of construction and sources of income. And so when I had this big funding from the European Research Council on this topic, I actually paid some of the people I knew who had been conducting the surveys on vulnerability. For instance, one study was on Hurricane Mitch in the Caribbean and Central America. There was like tens of thousands of fatalities. And they had detailed interviews after Hurricane Mitch, but they asked all kinds of issues, but they didn't bother to ask about the education of people in the household. So I paid them to go back to the same households and collect this additional information. And to their big surprise, but not to my surprise, because that's why I asked them to do this additional analysis, the statistical analysis showed that really the education of the head of household was the single most important determinant of lowering vulnerability. And I mean, there are so many causal pathways that these people, they understand the warnings better, they are more up to date of what could be done to use protective measures. These days we have weather forecasts, and if you are educated, you have much better access, and you can also even you have a better foresight and a better planning horizon in your own behavior to take preventive measures. So that is, we could show that for prevention, really education mattered greatly. Interestingly, also for recovery after the disaster, let's assume you were hit by the disaster, it turned out that the more educated people recovered much more quickly in terms of their own health or also their livelihood, their dwelling unit. And this even after controlling for income. So it was not the money that made them recover faster, but it was their cognitive skills. And in one paper, we even went one step further, that we hypothesized it's not so much the knowledge that you get, but it is really rather basic abstraction skills that are underlying. And that is what also the education science shows very clearly, that with literacy comes the possibility for more cohesive abstract thinking. And abstract thinking is something that is required to take precautions against something you have not yet personally experienced. Let me give an example of the tsunami. A colleague of mine, Raya Mutarak, was leading a study there in southern Thailand, where after the big 2004 tsunami, there was a decade later another tsunami warning, and after that warning, they went to interview the people to see whether they reacted correctly to what you should do when a tsunami warning comes. This was due to a Japanese earthquake at that time, and it turned out that the people who had already experienced a tsunami, who were living in that area, they all knew what to do, sort of take your essentials, what you need, and run to higher elevation levels. But about half of the population had recently moved to the coastal areas because this is a touristic areas, and many people from inland Thailand moved there to the coastal areas. They did not experience the tsunami in 2004. And here we found a major educational divide. The uneducated people, when they heard about tsunami warning, they were helpless. They didn't know what to do. They stayed around and were confused. But the more educated, who also did not experience the tsunami, but they could imagine what it was. They could think the counterfactual that they did not yet have experienced. And they did the right things because they had this abstract thinking. They could imagine what it was. So this was a very clear-cut proof that abstraction skills associated with basic education really help you to be better prepared for such disasters.
That's good to know. And to our final question, Prof. Lutz, for emerging researchers, for policymakers, and for educators who are passionate about bridging the gap between education, population dynamics, and environmental sustainability, what key advice, or I would say strategies, would you recommend to foster lasting change globally?
I think it's very clear what my research indicates, that there should be an overriding priority to universal basic education, particularly of girls, but of course girls need to catch up with men in many societies. Now, I think it's even fair to say that among all the Sustainable Development Goals and these 169 more specific targets, universal basic education is probably the priority number one. Maybe together with some basic health, because if you are in very poor health, children cannot go to school. But basic health and basic education, they really come before and are prerequisite, a root cause of many of these other desirable outcomes that are listed in the Sustainable Development Goals. And this insight needs to be implemented into the heads of policymakers, particularly in Africa. Because, many economists have told them different things in the past. And also in terms of the incentives, it's so much easier, I don't know, to open a new highway. It is visible to everybody. You invest it quickly, and after a couple of years, it's ready. Or a new airport or a new dam that is directly associated with the policymaker and that is being appreciated by the public. If you invest in rural schools, hardly anybody sees it. There's no immediate prestigious gain for the policymakers. Yet these rural schools are more important in the long run for the future of the country than these highways are. And I don't want to play the one against the other, but I mean, both also highways are of course needed to have access to markets. But without the basic skills of basic education, there is just no future for these societies. And so it's in a way an uphill struggle because of this lower visibility, the lower prestige there is to be gained for policymakers. They need to be even more convinced of the need and the priority for this. And it's also an uphill struggle, particularly in the context of Africa, where there's still a large number of children. The populations are still growing. There are still in some countries 5, 6, 7 children on average per woman. Of course, universal school enrollment is difficult enough under a population that is not growing, but in such a very rapidly growing population, it is also an uphill battle to really bring all these kids into school. And as I said, if they don't enter school at a young age and learn how to read and write, there is evidence they will hardly ever learn how to read and write later in their lives. So these are sort of the two main challenges that I also will try to address with my Yidan Prize project in sub-Saharan Africa.
Awesome. I think that's a very, very good note to kind of wrap up the episode. I think we all have an idea of the importance of education, but through this episode, it's actually been really insightful to see how strong of a causal relationship education has to a lot of these development challenges that we have. So thank you so much for your time and your insights, and sharing your experience with us. We're really appreciative of you being on the podcast. And I'll let Toby finish.
Yes,
thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much, Prof. Lutz, for being on the podcast. I think for me, one thing that is clear, as Labake has mentioned, is that education, population dynamics, and sustainability, they're not separate challenges, right? But they're connected in a way towards our collective future. And to our listeners, I just want to say that the choices we make today, whether in policy, either in education, or even in community engagement, will definitely determine the resilience of our planet and the well-being of our future generations. So please, let's continue to ask those hard questions. Let's continue to seek both solutions and drive the change, because like I always say, the future is not something we inherit, it's something that we build. And so I want to say thank you for joining us on the podcast, guys. And until next time, let's keep pushing towards a greener, smarter, and a more sustainable world. Thank you so much, Prof. And we definitely will keep in touch and looking forward to seeing the amazing things and the many awards and the prizes that you get to win in the future.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. All the